All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I'm Rick Urrutia, here with my co-host, Brian Pfeiffer. In this episode, we bring you this week's labor news and a really cool interview with author Steve Babson, who's going to talk about his latest book titled Forgotten Populists: When Farmers Turn Left to Save Democracy. In doing so, Brother Steve is going to school us on some U.S. labor history, and Brian will offer a more thorough introduction to Brother Steve in just a little bit. Though I will say this interview really reminded me of being in labor history class. It's eye-opening, inspiring, makes you proud to be in working class, and provides nuggets of wisdom for today's struggle. So in that same spirit, this week we're sharing an internationalist anti-fascist jam that Brian turned me on to today, so hope you enjoy.
And 10 years before I saw the light of morn, a convict ship of heroes was laid. From every corner of the world came sailing the 15th International Brigade. They came to stand beside the Spanish people to try and stem the rising fascist tide. Franco's allies were the powerful and wealthy. Frank Ryan's men came from the other side. Even the olives were bleeding as the battle for Madrid.
All right, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to today's episode of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. Going to cover some news briefs before we get to our interview tonight. And the first item on the agenda is Southwest pilots vote overwhelmingly to authorize a strike. And this news article is coming from ABC News, and it reads as follows. The Southwest Airlines Pilot Association said pilots with the airline voted to authorize a strike, with 99% of the pilots voting in favor. The strike authorization vote was seen as a referendum gauging sentiment on how the union and pilots feel pay negotiations have been going, with 98% of pilots participating in the vote, SWAPA said. SWAPA is the union. SWAPA President Casey Murray said, quote, "The lack of leadership and the unwillingness to address the failures of our organization have led us to this point. Our pilots are tired of apologizing to our passengers or on behalf of a company that refuses to place its priorities on its internal and external customers." While the vote was overwhelmingly in favor of a strike, federal law has barriers in place that would present a challenge for airline unions to fully authorize a strike. You know, Brian, so that's one thing, right? Like, I'm starting to see that this is the second time I've seen, I guess in recent history, that I've seen a news article cite the law for us. Also just remind us that, hey, now, but you know, airline strike is illegal, railroad strike is illegal. And I just wanted to note that. And I wanted to once again say what I've been saying all along on this podcast, is that in the world of labor law, it's not so much what's legal and what's illegal as far as strikes and boycotts and secondary strikes and, you know, working class tactics. It's not so much what's legal and what's illegal, but how you can get away with it. It's about thinking 5 steps ahead of the bosses. So just wanted to point that out there. Saw this in this article, needed to pause on that. The article continues. Southwest said the vote would not affect scheduled flights or operations like plane maintenance. And then it starts to wrap up by saying, on Friday, United Airlines pilots expressed frustration after working without a raise for over 4 years amid ongoing negotiations. Strike authorizations were voted on by pilots with American Airlines as well. So we have a few things going on in the airline industry.
That's right, Rick. And I would like just back up your point there about fighting for our rights as workers. We later on, we will play the interview with Brother Steve Babson, and he did mention the UAW strike at General Motors in the 1930s. And there was many things on that strike that were illegal, such as the occupation of the plant. But the workers took the position in the union that a job is a property right. So they occupied the plant, their sweat went into the plant, and that was technically illegal, as was other actions. But because of their resistance and their occupation and their picket lines and their support from the community and workers on the move all over the country supporting them, they won the first ever collective bargaining contract at GM, which, as Brother Babson said, ushered in an entire generation of new workers organizing unions and the CIO and elsewhere. Also, Dr. King, we also talked about Dr. King, quoted him in that interview. And it's also important to remind those in the movement today that might not be aware that Dr. King often, I think all the time, most of the time, I think it's true historically, we'd have to research this, but defied every injunction that was laid down against his organization or himself, because he said it's about what's morally right, not about property rights. Our lives are worth more than any property or any boss's stolen profits. So thanks for raising that, Rick.
No doubt, and CBS also put out an article about this potential strike that I think is also worth discussing a little bit, at least where I'm at right now. So this article reads, Brian Bunkers, a 737 captain of the airline, said pay and benefits are part of the problem, but more so it's the scheduling. Bunkers said once a pilot clocks in, they can be forced extended into days that we're not expecting to work. Okay, forced extended into days that they were not expecting to work. Let's highlight that for a second, but keep reading here until we finish. They can be reassigned to working on their days off so they can't count on their kids' dentist appointments, T-ball games, anniversaries, birthdays, Bunkers said outside of Terminal 3 on Friday. Our current work rules are over 11 years old. You may have seen recently other airlines authorizing strikes, and that is one step that we can take that will possibly come in the future.
Yeah, this is absolutely outrageous. Once again, we see the absolute categorical, just complete, not just disrespect, but outrageous actions of the bosses in terms of these work schedules and what they're putting on not only the airline pilots, but their loved ones, and of course the public at large. It's clear through this quote that this union member, the only thing that cares, these airline bosses care about is profits. And it's wonderful to see them taking action. The airline pilots and their allies, I'm sure many others in the airline industry are supporting them, and we're with them all the way. So sorry, go ahead, Rick.
Kind of to give people a sneak preview of the interview that's coming up, that's one of the ideas that came up in the interview, that we have to find our commonalities in this struggle. And to see that the pilots don't have time to see their kids or go to their baseball games or dentist appointments, take care of their personal matters, that's something that could be said of a Starbucks worker. That's something that could be said of a ramp agent working for an airline. That's something that could be said for many jobs. And so just wanted to highlight that as well. And also just finally highlight that, that's one of the tools that capitalism uses to extract more profits from the labor of workers, is extending the length of the workday. Rather than hiring more pilots and giving them good jobs, they would rather further exploit a pilot and extend their shift, extend their day, extend their flights, stuff like that. So just wanted to put that out there. Moving on with labor news, we also have some more news from Germany. So this article caught my attention. It's called, the title is German Rail Union Cancels Planned Two-Day Strike After Employers Meet Minimum Wage Demand. This is an Associated Press article, and it reads as follows. A labor union representing more than 200,000 railway workers in Germany said Saturday that it was canceling plans for a two-day strike after employers met one of its key demands. The EVG union said earlier this week that its members would walk out for 50 hours from late Sunday until late Tuesday. Rail company Deutsche Bahn said this would have affected all long-distance travel during that period, and warned that most regional trains also wouldn't run. Deutsche Bahn had sought a court injunction against the strike, of course, insisting that it had agreed to the union's demand for the minimum wage of 12 euros an hour to be ensured through basic pay rather than with bonuses. Negotiations on a broader deal continue. The strike, which would have affected dozens of other rail companies, as well as freight traffic, would have been one of the biggest in recent years following a previous large-scale walkout in April.
That's right, Rick. Here we see both sides of the same coin, right? The capitalist bosses playing the same or similar activities against the workers who are striking. Also, on the positive side, the workers here in Berlin who are striking are similar to the railroad workers here in this country, in the United States, who of course, almost had a strike themselves last fall and are agitating on all kinds of different fronts on safety and wages and putting forth nationalization of the railroads here in the US. And the solidarity that could be built here internationally might be taking place, but it could be quite something to have RWU members go to Germany and German workers coming here, for example, as well as other workers around Europe who, like in France, we've reported on that are engaging in various actions. Also, we've also discussed on the show the importance of organizing in these sectors like transportation, sectors that are moving goods, such as dock workers in the United States. These are still highly unionized sectors, the Teamsters, etc. And there's many possibilities here, not only for internal union solidarity and community solidarity, but also, as we're seeing here in Berlin, international solidarity with workers as well.
On the academic front, so Geo 3550 in Ann Arbor and Oakland school teachers are still on strike. And you can get regular strike updates on the Geo website, which are the letters GEO, the numbers 3550.org. The organization, the union, posts regular strike updates. And as far as Oakland teachers, you can go to Oakland EA, the letter E, the letter A.org. And link to their current social media to stay current on where those are at. Last I read, I caught a couple of quick articles. The Oakland teachers were looking to hopefully settle over the course of the weekend, and Geo has been on strike for a month now. So you can go to their websites and find buttons to donate to their strike funds or, take whatever actions that they may suggest.
That's right. And listeners, just a reminder, we did interview Yeager, who is a member of the bargaining committee there in Ann Arbor, as well as the vice president of the adjunct local a couple episodes ago, and you can find that on our Facebook page, We Rise Fighting.
All right, and we have started to cover the Writers Guild strike, the Hollywood strike, if you will. That's been in the works for a couple of weeks now, and I found an article in CNN.com, the title being, "With Writers' Strike Underway, Film and TV Studios Start Labor Talks with Directors." And the article reads, "Television and film studios already dealing with the strike by the Writers Guild of America started contract negotiations on Wednesday with the Directors Guild of America, or DGA. If the talks break down, they could lead to even broader work stoppages on film and television sets nationwide. SAG-AFTRA, the nation that represents actors, is due to begin their own talks next month. The industry is undergoing major changes because of the shift to streaming, and all three sets of talks could prove difficult. Without a quick resolution, American audiences may be left without much new content to watch later this year or in early 2024. Quote, "We know there will be conflict," said Todd Holland, a member of the Directors Negotiating Committee, in a message to the union's 19,000 members. "The battle will test us. We won't rest until we win a strong contract today that builds a bridge to continue DGA prosperity into the future," unquote. The shift to streaming has upended the economics of the industry. Most streaming services outside of Netflix have been losing money, although Warner Brothers Discovery, the owner of CNN, just reported its first narrow profit from its streaming service. The explosive popularity of streaming around the world has transformed how and where our work is viewed, and our contracts must adapt to changing production and distribution, said Karen Gaviola, another member of the directors' negotiating team. But the economics of traditional media are also becoming more difficult, with ad revenues slumping and movie box office still well below pre-pandemic levels. And this is ultimately the part that I wanted to get to in the article, actually. So the studios are represented in negotiations by the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, which includes Amazon, Apple, CBS, Disney, NBC Universal, Netflix, Paramount Global, Sony, and Warner Brothers Discovery. So honestly, that was news to me. I didn't know exactly who the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers were, who they were made up of. And turns out, well, no major surprise, but the major media conglomerates of the US. So this strike is a big deal. This strike is taking on some of the biggest corporations in the US, some of the largest media conglomerates in the US.
That's right, Rick. And the Teamsters Local is refusing to cross picket lines. And we're hoping that more solidarity can be built between the directors, of course, and the other workers in the industry. This looks to be a foundational strike, of course, at the Writers Guild, both the East and West Coast, 11,000 workers, and potentially It might be quite a spring and summer. And it also goes to the heart of some of the many times we've discussed the potential for solidarity between and among workers in all these different sectors, from Starbucks workers to the Teamsters to the media workers, writers, etc., actors, and what could be done this summer, and many, many creative actions that could be taking place and are taking place, but could be stepped up. And academic workers, 48,000 uh, academic workers at the UAW went on strike in California. So there's many, many, all kinds of labor actions are taking place besides the Writer Guild strike in New York City. So just putting that on the table for potential ideas that could be uh, talked about and creative actions that could be done.
And then finally in the news today, just an update from the Rutgers strike. I came across a Labor Notes article. If you're not familiar with Labor Notes, I highly recommend them for your labor news as well. You can find them online at labornotes.org. And again, this article about the Rutgers strike is coming from Labor Notes, and it reads as follows. After a 5-day strike in April, members of the Rutgers faculty, graduate student, librarian, and clinicians unions voted 93% to accept a new contract, which included dramatic gains. The strike was the first in Rutgers' 253-year history and remarkable in all that instructional workers walked out, including full-time faculty, graduate workers, and adjuncts. The agreement includes big salary gains, 30% for the lowest paid adjuncts in the first year and 43% across the life of the contract, plus 33% raises for graduate teaching and research assistants. For adjuncts, it also includes multi-semester and multi-year appointments at first, as well as professional development funding, binding arbitration for grievances, quicker and new paths to advancement, and a new title. We're no longer quote unquote part-time lecturers, but simply lecturers. And the article continues, but that's how much I'm sharing tonight. So congratulations to Rutgers University and the workers who struggled to make those gains. I hope there is consensus and that the workers are satisfied with the contract. That struggle and the struggle at Ann Arbor and other graduate worker struggles has definitely given us many lessons for us in the labor movement today, as far as democratic unions, as far as alliances with the community, as far as strike preparation and execution. So thank you, Rutgers, and thank you, Geo Local 3550, who continues in their strike struggle, for giving us those lessons.
All right, and now we turn towards our interview with Brother Steve Babson, who's a labor educator and union activist living in Detroit. Now retired, Babson worked as an instructor and extension program coordinator in the Labor Studies Center at Wayne State University. He's the author of various books, including Working Detroit, The Making of a Union Town, and The Color of Law, Ernie Goodman, and the Struggle for Labor and Civil Rights in Detroit. Brother Babson is also an executive board member of AAUP-AFT Local 6075, which represents about 1,700 full-time faculty and academic staff at Wayne State University in Detroit. And he's also leader of the Detroit Eviction Defense, an organization that fights foreclosures and evictions in the city of Detroit. So, Brother Babson, we're honored to have you today. Welcome. We usually start just asking our folks we have on the show to tell us about yourself, where you're from, how you became a union member, and in your case, an educator. So, thanks.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I ended up coming around to the labor movement basically as a result of the struggle against the war in Vietnam, which also gives an indication of how old I am. So I was subject to the draft in the 1960s, and I didn't have any previous exposure to the labor movement except for one very specific episode. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. My dad was a businessman, so I was not actually raised in a union culture. But I did start working on merchant ships in the summers at age 16. So I was a member of the National Maritime Union. And when I was at an undergraduate, I was subject to the draft, and I saw no reason to join any effort to go halfway around the world and start murdering innocent people on behalf of U.S. foreign policy. And I was not alone in that regard. There was a massive movement that encouraged and supported and reinforced that resistance to the draft. And I remember distinctly as I was looking for information about what was going on and trying to put all of this in context, that I came across a booklet published by the United Electrical Workers, which of course is a union that was subject to enormous repression during the 1950s and the Red Scare and union raiding by conservative unions, but still has maintained and is still hanging on, dramatically diminished membership. But they had a booklet about the war in Vietnam that placed it in the context of U.S. imperialism and economic history and labor history in a way I hadn't ever seen before. And it was very exciting for me. For a brief minute, I thought, wow, the labor movement is pretty progressive. And UE was, and 1199 and a few other unions, but unfortunately, the AFL-CIO at that time was very conservative and devoted to the war and supporting the war in Vietnam as part of their support for the Democratic Party. So I learned a lot more about unions over time and identified with the progressive unions that were up and about. And in Boston, worked with as usually dissident organizations within some of the more that were opposing the more conservative leadership that was prevalent in many of the unions of that day. And all of that turned in a very different direction when my wife and I moved to Detroit. She got a job with the United Auto Workers, Nancy Brigham, and I ended up at Wayne State University, where I worked on my doctorate. And but in the meantime, and for many years thereafter, worked in the Labor Studies Center as part of the extension program. I was not a professor, I was academic staff and an instructor. And so for the next 25 years, I worked with the UAW, with the steel workers, with the electrical workers, utility workers on contract campaigns, organizing, political education, and stewards training, and so on. Usually off campus, often in the local union hall, often enough in the factory itself. So it gave me a unique perspective on the day-to-day issues and people's interest in and curiosity about labor history and about how to put their current struggles in a context that linked it to the economic and social conditions they were familiar with and wanted to know how that had happened, what the background to it was. And I also was learning some of the rudiments of contract campaigns and one-on-one organizing on the shop floor, but also in my own union, because I became active in the American Association of University Professors, and in particular was among the folks who pushed for a joint affiliation with the American Federation of Teachers so that we would have support from the broader labor movement. That turned out to be very important because we had a series of strikes. I was strike chairman, I was on the executive board, I was editor of the newsletter. So I was immersed in academic unionism at the same time that I'm also spending a lot of time with progressive local unions in the Detroit area and learning a lot about their circumstances, even as I was also immersed in my own very particular situation in higher ed. So that sort of brought me to where I'm at now. And the book that I just published is called Forgotten Populists: When Farmers Turned Left to Save Democracy, which for some people might be kind of counterintuitive because these days they don't really associate farmers with progressive politics. But this is talking about the origins of progressive politics in the United States, really linked to the Knights of Labor as the Populists being the first mass organization organized on a multiracial basis, along with the Knights of Labor, to contest and resist the emergence of corporate capitalism and the oligarchy of their day, the mega rich who are the granddaddies of the Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and the rest of them today.
All right, Steve, we're going to get into some specifics of the book and have some questions for you directly. We'd like to start with, in your craft, you have a similar approach to writing history as Robin D.G. Kelly, Dr. Kelly, and Howard Zinn. Some have called this people's history, and you mentioned some of that in your response to coming up in your development over the years. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm proud to be linked with those names. Those are the folks that I've admired in the course of my career in labor education and as a union activist. And what it means to me is that you write, you're looking at history as it is linked to current present day issues. And that means that there is a need in the history profession for people to develop the skills and the research capacity, sometimes on narrowly focused matters that give them the opportunity to learn archival methods and how you go about cross-examining the evidence. But really what we need to talk about is not the obscure matters, but the general drift and summary of a historical context that will help people orient themselves today. And so, and do so in a way that's, by the way, accessible to people who, and in the case of the book I just published, it's a short book on a big topic. And it's really intended for people who might not take on a longer book, and where whatever material you put in front of them is competing in a digital age with highly graphic and short messaging. So Forgotten Populists is organized on an 8.5 by 11 format with a lot of illustrations and captions. I'm sort of anticipating that a lot of people will open it and basically look at the pictures, read the captions, and go from there, and hopefully find that compelling and draw them into the text as well. And if they care to, the end notes are there to establish the basis upon which I'm talking about matters in a way different from what people might find that they're familiar with, because usually these issues in their experience in education have been downplayed or ignored altogether, and these days sometimes being banned from any discussion at all. So it's a combination of what I believe and confident is a historically sound and capable approach to that historical material, but is formulated in and presented in a way that links it to people's ongoing issues and present day concerns.
So there's a lot of issues taking place right now in the U.S. and of course the world with working people in response to a variety of unfortunate situations that are developing, and we can talk about that in depth. But just generally, what's the reason for this book at this time in U.S. history? What was your inspiration to write this book at this time right now?
Well, a lot of it had to do with our recent experience with the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, in which Donald Trump was frequently described, still is described by many of the unwitting or the manipulative, as a populist, and is equated with the likes of Bernie Sanders, which is a preposterous argument, and it's totally ahistorical and has nothing to do with the actual historical legacy of the populist movement of the 1890s, which, as I said, was multiracial, was one of the first organizations to address the question of voting rights for women, was trying to develop a common program for Black and white farmers in the South, and addressing a whole range of abusive practices by the emerging corporate powers of that day, which were principally the railroads. And I wanted to make clear that those who use this today, who talk about Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump as both somehow sharing some kind of common ground, both one is a left populist, if they specify it at all, and the other is a right populist. But what is the populist, quote unquote, that they have in common? And it's nonsense. They really have nothing in common to speak of. If you press them on it, there is a body of academic theorizing that says, well, what they have in common is that they both are attacking elites. They're anti-elitist. But on that ground, well, so was Richard Nixon. He was mobilizing on behalf of the silent majority against the media elite. And in fact, in American politics, it's commonplace for politicians to run against Washington or run against the banks or run against the media. It's generally in this political context. Here in North America, it's anti-elitism is the sort of organizing ground for a lot of politicians. And Bernie's anti-elitist, but he's anti-Trump and he's anti-oligarchy. He's anti the corporate powers that are basically using their wealth to translate it into political power to reinforce their control over the economy. And I wanted to make clear that those who therefore are equating Sanders and Trump are actually one of two people. They're either unwitting and using a phrase that is in vogue and gives the appearance of historical insight, or they're ideologues, in which what they're trying to do is say that anyone who is articulating an approach outside of the bounds of an elite-defined consensus, and that consensus is that corporate gigantism is natural and efficient, that the meritocracy is inevitable and is a natural expression of different capacities, maybe exaggerated here and there, maybe a little fine-tuning, but the elite consensus is that anyone who's outside of those boundaries is somehow unworthy of our support, is to be regarded as manipulative, and somehow, therefore, untrustworthy, that they're untrustworthy manipulators. And certainly that's true of Trump, but why call him a populist? Let's call him what he is. He's a demagogue. He's an authoritarian. And on that basis, we can talk much more accurately about what he is. Bernie Sanders has a certain, there's a historical link to the populists and what they were about in the 1890s, but they were across the board in terms of talking about progressive reform. They were talking about graduated income tax. They were talking about nationalizing the railroads, which were extraordinarily mismanaged, usually bankrupt, were killing 2,600 workers a year in the 1890s. They were talking about publicly owned utilities. They were talking about a whole range of reforms, including election of senators. At that time, in the 1890s, they were appointed. They were talking about recall and referendums. They were talking about votes for women. They were talking about replacing the privately owned national banks with postal savings banks. They were talking about something that's really, in a way, looks like social democracy. And it's at the same time that politics is developing in Europe. And so it's a naturally forming resistance to corporate oligarchy. And it's really the headwaters of every progressive movement that followed. It's no surprise to me that Eugene Debs, who was then the leader of the Socialist Party in the early 20th century, was a populist. Clarence Darrow was a populist. A whole range of people that we might know their individual names turns out are linked through this populist connection, including Coxey. You've heard of Coxey's Army, perhaps, the first mass march on Washington. Well, he was a co-founder of the Ohio Populist Party. And across the board, there is a link here with a mass movement that I think should be elevated in our understanding and its visibility and seen as the legacy that we count on, that we see ourselves part of, in taking a stance that has a natural basis in our history, contesting the power of corporate oligarchy.
Thanks, Steve. So in your work, what I noticed in reading this work of the latest book, Forgotten Populists, as well as previous work, and historically, you've always undergirded your analysis with the horrific role of slavery within the U.S. and internationally, which of course was the economic foundations for modern day monopoly capitalism. And you've also given prominent treatment to the role of the Black freedom struggle in its many forms in your latest book, Forgotten Populists, as well as previously. Why is this fundamentally part of your work historically?
Well, it has to be. I mean, there's no other way of understanding what's going on in the United States without a recognition of our specific history, going back to a time when 4 million workers in the United States were enslaved. And the formation of the steps by which that is linked to the opposition to wage slavery, which was seen as linked in some respects. In the case of the Populists, also their opposition to convict leasing, which is a measure of just how far things could go in the wrong direction when the mega rich, the corporate leadership, the corporate elite has such profound control over the political and public resources that they can choose to do as they did in 1891 in Tennessee, when the first organization, the United Mine Workers, coming out of the Knights of Labor, begins insisting on collective bargaining over their wages and working conditions in the Tennessee coal mines. They all of a sudden, the employers contact the state and they lease convicts from the penitentiary system for pennies a day and replace the entire labor force, which was 90% white, 10% free black. And the miners had good reason to call this the use of state slaves. And so there's a gradation of subordination and exploitation, which in our history includes literal enslavement, but also includes debt peonage, includes convict leasing, it includes basically the crop lien system, which was also a form of, in fact, enslavement in the South, where farmers who were so dependent on credit, and if you think about it, someone who's growing cotton or growing wheat, they are dependent on credit because there's only one time in the year when they actually are going to collect money, and that's what they harvest. It's not like truck farming or dairy farming. If you're growing wheat or corn or cotton, the commodity crop, you have to borrow money. There's no other way you can afford to get seed and food and hardware and fertilizer. You have to borrow that money. And in the South, the system was one in which the furnishing man, often also the landlord, would be providing those supplies at extraordinarily jacked up prices and with high interest embedded as well. The effective interest rate was over 100% in many, many locations across the South. I mean, that's usury is an understatement in that context. And so the furnishing man would then insist on a crop lien where the farmer, whether a tenant farmer or sharecropper, or a farm owner of the property itself, but still linked and dependent on that furnishing man, would have to surrender the control of the crop at harvest to the furnishing man as a lien. So that actually it was being sold by the holder of the debt, and he would then control the accounting for whether or not the revenue from that sale was enough to satisfy your debt. And surprise, surprise, it usually didn't. And so you were held in a perpetual bondage with this whole system of debt. Well, again, the question is slavery, therefore, it goes through these gradations of debt peonage, of crop lien, of convict leasing, and wage slavery itself under circumstances where if you try to organize, you're going to be subjected to almost immediate suppression and often enough fatal violence.
So in addition to that, in Forgotten Populist, Rick, did you have something?
Go. Sure. I'll go ahead. Hey, Steve. So, throughout this chat, we've heard lots of references to labor history, and we like to cater to younger workers, to people who aren't as experienced or veterans in the labor movement. And so I was wondering what nuggets of wisdom you would like to take from labor history, from the labor movement, and offer to someone, say, like, a graduate worker who's on strike, a graduate student worker who's on strike, or a Starbucks worker who's completely new to the movement and, just fresh to the movement. What nuggets of wisdom would you offer them?
What I would urge them to look for and understand the connections between the many, many disparate workplaces, which in some ways look so different, and where we can easily fall into a belief that we share so little in common. whether it's academic workers or UPS workers or auto workers. Different realms, different circumstances, and certainly the academic workers on the one hand and say auto workers or UPS drivers on the others appear to be in such different realms. It's hard to understand how they would have a common interest if you're only looking at the superficial features of their work. I would say take a look at what you share actually in all of those different realms. What's common to them these days, if you think about it, is precariousness of work, lack of job security, and tiering, the second tiering or the part-timing. And it's almost, you can use those words to describe exactly what's going on in UPS, in auto, and in academia. I know that for me, and my experience as an activist in an academic union was that we were constantly fighting battles over the use of part-timers and the use of adjuncts. And we finally tried to do our best to organize them rather than simply try to push them away. But we had to make it more expensive for the university administration to replace full-time tenure track academics with part-time and adjunct instructors. And we had to build up and try to improve the conditions for those often abused, usually abused part-timers and lower tier pay to make it less economically attractive to replace the full-timers. And I think the same issue is going on full-timers and tenure track. I think the same issues, if you look at what's going on with UPS and the auto workers, they're talking about second tier pay, people doing the same work, paid less money with fewer benefits or no benefits at all. And then oxymorons like permanent part-timer or permanent temporary worker, temporary workers, quote unquote, who are on the job then for years. And so I think actually what we would find today is that increasingly these issues are across the board, and the basis for solidarity may not be apparent with a superficial look at the circumstances of the work, but it become, I think, more evident once we actually ask questions about what the key issues are facing people across the board in many of these industrial and academic settings.
All right, Steve. I have a two-part question from essentially relating to Black leaders such as Miss Ida B. Wells and Dr. King that you mentioned in Forgotten Populist. On page 47, you quote Dr. King from his speech in Alabama in 1965, where he addressed 25,000. And the quote, of course, has a language from that period. So listeners know that. So it's from 1965. Dr. King stated, quote, "The leaders of this movement began awakening the poor white masses and the former Negro slaves to the fact that they were being fleeced by the emerging Bourbon interest. The Populists began uniting the Negro and the white masses into a voting bloc that threatened to drive the Bourbon interest from the command posts of political power. In response, the ruling elite passed laws that made it a crime for, as Dr. King said, Negroes and whites to come together as equals at any level," end quote. And that was a direct quote from Dr. King in 1965. Why did you include that quote in the book?
Included it because it's important for me to establish that the likes of George Wallace are not populists. And that's, again, part of this whole ahistorical nonsense about who the populists were, and much of it relating back to the 1950s and the initial misrepresentations about who the populists were as part of the Red Scare and a very conservative twist that was given to a lot of U.S. history. But George Wallace, who, like many politicians, could opportunistically identify himself with the needs of working people, did so in a way that was also perfectly compatible with Jim Crow white supremacy, meaning he was identifying with white workers and appealing to white workers, and did so on the basis of, you will be protected in your privileged status as white workers against any competition with a black labor force. And so that's completely contradictory to what the populists were trying to do. That doesn't mean that populists succeeded in establishing and developing a multiracial movement. There were some real weaknesses to how they went about it, and there was an internal debate over how to do so in a way that was credible and sustainable. And they ultimately failed. But they were the first major party to actually debate that internally. How do you find a common ground for black and white workers, for black and white farmers on an economic basis to take on the ruling elite? Now, the Republican Party, of course, historically, during the Civil War and the immediate aftermath, was associated with protection for black voters, but not on the basis of a shared economic challenge to the mega rich. For obvious reasons, that's not what the Republicans were about. And by the 1890s, they are no longer devoted to that at all. They had already surrendered Reconstruction in the 1870s, and by the 1890s, the dominant faction within the Republican Party was nicknamed, quote unquote, the Lily Whites, because they no longer wanted any black candidates in any part of the South, because even in a majority black district, there would be whites who, quote, would have to vote for a black candidate, and they weren't going to do that. The populists were actually contesting that matter in internal debates, and often enough, we're coming up with an approach that said, it doesn't matter to us, it's the economic interests that are paramount. And on the executive boards, executive committees of the Populist Party in Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia, there were black members of the executive committee. This would have been completely impossible in both the Republican or the Democratic Party. So I thought King was a way of making it clear that there is an understanding that's correct, that there is something we can look back to and see a continuity of progressive thinking and efforts at enormous risk, by the way, because both black and white populists were subject to an extraordinary amount of blowback, and might mean that they would be boycotted, that they would not be able to get credit, that they were subject to harassment by police, that they would be laid off and fired, that they would be blacklisted. And for black folks in the South, they were already subject to that, and in addition would be at risk of physical assault and murder often enough. That's how the origins of Jim Crow are the defeat of populism. Populism is a major turning point in American history because before the 1890s, there was no political organization on a national level that was contesting this ideology of small government, that government had to be kept to a minimum. The populists are the first to say there's nothing small about government when it's wedded to big business. Then it becomes a weapon of big business. And what populists were about were saying, we need to take back the government with democratic reforms that protect the will of the people to make the government an instrument for defending the interests of working people. Now, of course, they were naive about what some of the dangers are of government employers as well. And so we've learned that lesson in the intervening decades, that public employees need protection as well. But that's a turning point in American history, and it's the first step towards what later became the New Deal, which was kind of a neo-populist moment in the 20th century, where a lot of the things the populists have been fighting for are finally being implemented. Some of them only in halfway measures, and certainly many of them now are at risk, already substantially eroded. But that's what our history is about. The populists are that positive potential for taking on in a systemic way, an approach that says across the board, it's a system, and we have to actually think about altering it and changing it top to bottom.
So, Steve, the second part of that question that you raise in your new book, Forgotten Populist, is something that even today, with many progressive historians is not often written about, and that is the aristocracy's counter-revolutionary coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, that took place in 1898. And also in 1898, the U.S. invaded and occupied Cuba, the Philippines, and Hawaii. Can you please describe what took place in Wilmington and your view why, and maybe some connection between that domestic and international situation?
Yeah, again, it's a remarkable episode and not recognized often enough. But part of the defeat of populism that inaugurates Jim Crow is at the point of a gun. And in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a town council, black and white members of the town council in a city that had a substantial black population, probably more than 50%, as we understand it. And there was a city government that was a coalition of populists and Republicans. Now, they might not have a whole lot in common in terms of their economic interests, but they both had a shared interest in resisting the efforts of the Democratic Party, which was white supremacists, in simply ruling out and blocking any kind of alternative political initiative. So they were trying to protect the vote in North Carolina. The populists, in addition, were pushing for the whole range of reforms that we've been talking about. And in 1896, when the Democratic Party co-opted part of the populist program, William Jennings Bryan wins nomination for president in 1896. He only takes on a few selected parts of the populist program: coinage of silver, a ban on court injunctions to break strikes. He wants to regulate railroads, but that's about it. He doesn't want any of the Postal Savings Bank or nationalizing the railroads and so on. It's a very limited program, but it does shift within the Democratic Party and eventually will produce in the North and the West a Democratic Party devoted to the New Deal and a different kind of politics. But in the South, it reinforces, because Bryan had no interest in challenging white supremacy and the denial of the vote. So in North Carolina, after Bryan is defeated in 1896, there is a escalating terror campaign to suppress populists in the South. And in 1898, white supremacists organize basically an invasion of Wilmington, North Carolina, of about 600 heavily armed whites. They were called red shirts because they all wore the same red shirt. They have Winchester rifles. They did not necessarily, it's clear that there was elite sponsorship of this and leadership of it, and even equipping of them with these rifles. And they go into Wilmington with a list of about 60 folks they want to single out, and they proceed to murder them, make their way to the city council, and at gunpoint force the city council, the elected city council, to resign, and they're replaced on that same day with white supremacists. And there is no response from the McKinley presidency, the administration. It's Republican. There's no response from the Republican governor, even though this is a Democratic white supremacist movement. Democratic Party is sort of a bipartisan commitment to stamping out a black-white alliance on economic issues. And so nothing happens. There's simply this coup. The government is overthrown. There's 60 people are murdered in the streets, gunned down, and nothing happens. And I think what you're alluding to is that in the case of the Spanish-American War, begins the same year. It includes not only Cuba and Puerto Rico, but also the Philippines. And the populists initially, the remaining populists who are surviving but limping along, they support the war as a effort to overthrow Spanish tyranny and help liberation fighters that were already on the ground in Cuba and the Philippines in particular. There's mass insurgencies against Spanish rule, and the populists support an effort to overthrow the Spanish colonial government. They then come out and say, but there should be no annexation. And that's when they they have to then become resistant to what happened in the case of the Philippines, where we send in the U.S. Army, and we have basically the same strategy that was used in Vietnam, of strategic hamlets, where they would force the rural population into fortified zones, lock and key, and basically a program of extermination of the Filipino resistance. Over 15,000 of them are killed. Somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million Filipinos die in the course of this campaign to suppress their war for independence. They had a government that they had established. But in both cases, the Republican regime and white supremacist Democrats agree that neither Filipinos nor Black citizens in Wilmington, North Carolina, deserve control over their lives and over their politics. So it's a common sense that it will be white supremacy that rules in both North Carolina, the South in general, the U.S., and also the Philippines, and Cuba, and Puerto Rico.
So this leads to our question: what is your view on I think you mentioned, go back into the railroad strike a minute, and the American Railway Union, led by socialist Eugene Debs, and the influence today. Today, we're seeing the work being done by Railroad Workers United, the RWU, and their demand, of course, is part of their demands are the nationalization of the railroads, safety, and a variety of other issues that they're pushing. And of course, they were betrayed last fall by the Biden administration, among others. And what do you see as some of the historical continuum between the ARU, Debs, and the RWU of today?
Well, it's fascinating because in Debs's day, in early 1890s, he was addressing a circumstance that's still the case today, that the railroad labor force is divided into many different craft organizations. And there's a sort of hierarchy of skill and compensation that matches that. And that was true then, and it's true in different details, but basically the same system today. And both what Debs was about was organizing a bigger tent that would include all crafts and all occupations under a single union organization, the American Railway Union. And he organizes, and he is among the many organizing this effort to unify railroad workers and to challenge the power of the corporate elite that was mismanaging and misrepresenting and basically doing as they pleased when it came to imposing conditions. And it comes to a head with the Pullman strike. And that's a level of detail maybe we don't need to go into, but the result is a nationwide strike in which obviously what's at stake is the future of a industry which is either going to be unionized under an industrial basis or the union is going to be broken, and it's the latter that prevails. The government, basically on the pretext of protecting the transportation of the U.S. mail in terms of rail service, sends in several thousand federal troops. State militias are mobilized. There's a court injunction that the federal government seeks, and the union is broken, and Debs and other leaders of the union are put in jail. The question today comes down to some of the same circumstances. Where do they have the right to strike, and on what basis are they going to define their common interests across the many different crafts and occupations within the railroad industry? And does it make sense to talk about, in fact, a more humane and efficient organization of the industry on a public basis? And the railroad industry at several points has been so dysfunctional that the government has had to take it over in the past, most in recent decades, not too long ago, with Conrail and the collapse of the Pennsylvania Railroad. But back in World War I, the for-profit railroad system was so inept and poorly organized that actually they were not able to move the freight and the troops, and the government had to take over the rail system for 3 years. Amtrak is another measure of if you want an effective rail system that addresses human needs and doesn't exploit its workers, it probably is going to have to be publicly owned, and that's something that, again, the railroad workers are starting to talk about.
Brother Steve, in the course of tonight's discussion, you brought up Vietnam a couple of times and also talked about the protests against a war in Vietnam. And I was wondering, from your experience being around at that time, what did you see as some of the more effective strategies, tactics used to protest the war in Vietnam?
Well, there were many mass marches, but there had to be also the local organizing where you're canvassing people, you're talking to folks door to door. It has to be retail politics where and it requires a link between the two. Obviously on a local basis, you can also sometimes feel isolated and disconnected from a movement that might be able to make a substantial and effective difference. So it's a difficult matter, but it has to be both a national effort combined with intensive local retail politics of canvassing, of picketing, of meetings where you try to establish the commonality of what you're about. And for me personally, in these days, where I'm at is basically through Democratic Socialists of America. I think it makes sense for us as a progressive organization, people who believe in democratic socialism. Our priority is in our particular Detroit chapter here, and I think it's also something within DSA nationally, is to make a priority of supporting workers in UPS and in auto. And in the case of UPS, there's going to be, it looks like it's going to head to a strike. It'll be a nationwide event. 400,000 workers nearly involved over issues of temporary work, part-time work, two-tier systems, which is common issues across the board in a whole lot of different industries. And I think it's important for people to become active in that national campaign, but that will require our support at the local level. So picketing is going to become, I think, an important measure of what we have to do next. And I don't mean that we've become active in those strikes in a way where we start to assert any kind of control over the outcome of that strike. That's going to be up to the Teamster members and their capacity. And I'm confident that the current leadership of the Teamsters is going to do a good job of that. But it means that we organize wherever we are, our neighborhoods, our schools, our other workplaces, on behalf of supporting that national struggle. Because if they succeed, I think it can send a message to workers in a whole lot of other locations that change is possible, that's important, and that addresses circumstances they're also facing. And I would invoke the example of the 1930s, where there was what made the outcome in 1936, 1937, that wave of massive organizing across the country, where people in a whole range of industries were organizing at the same time. If you look back at what kicks that off, it's the General Motors sit-down strike. It was because General Motors was in effect, the main roadblock to union organization in the auto industry, and it was seen as symbolic of the capacity of massive corporations to win political support and control on behalf of their agenda. And when the sit-down strikers at General Motors forced the company to actually recognize the union and begin collective bargaining, that sent a message across the board. And what followed was, in effect, in Detroit, a rolling general strike that won union representation across a whole range of employers, not just in auto, but across a whole range of industrial settings. So I think it's sort of a long roundabout answer, but what I'm looking at is that we have to focus on national campaigns and our local capacity to intensify and build support across the board.
Okay, and also your general assessment as to what's going on in labor right now. You know, here on the show, we get pretty excited about the stuff that's happening with the UAW, as you already mentioned, with the Teamsters, Amazon, Starbucks workers. What's your general assessment? Do you see a coming upheaval? What's your general lay of the land assessment of labor right now?
Well, I'm hoping that we're heading towards a general upheaval, and I see signs that that's a possibility. I also see the difficulty of coordinating that with the necessary political changes that are going to have to also be occurring. And I see the two as interrelated. I don't believe in political action independent of mass action and direct action. I think the two build on each other. And again, I would invoke the example of the 1930s, the sit-down strikes and not just sit-down strikes, a whole range of organizing begins after the November 1936 presidential election, in which Franklin Roosevelt won re-election on the basis of a New Deal program that he had been pressured into by preceding organizing efforts and mass organization. But it's in 1936 that he wins, and some had believed that he might be at risk because, after all, his opposition controlled the print media and controlled radio, and the usual message people were seeing in their daily newspapers and on the radio waves was that he was a man who had to be defeated because he was an enemy of democracy and so on and so forth. And this was the owners of the corporate media, a constant drumbeat attacking what Roosevelt was about. And Roosevelt was reluctant in many of the things he was forced to do. But when Roosevelt won, to the surprise of some, this is what gave people, because now the basic National Labor Relations Act was the single most important issue in the 1936 election. That's what corporate America wanted to overturn, was the National Labor Relations Act, giving people some basic, not enough, but some basic protections for their right to organize for collective action. And so with that victory politically, it then empowers people's feeling of confidence on the shop floor and in their workplaces to take the initial steps towards organization and participation in a mass strike movement. So the two are linked. And what I'm not certain of is whether or not we're in the same cycle now, because Biden is not someone who is inspiring a whole lot of confidence that a labor agenda will be paramount in the coming days from this administration. So that worries me in terms of where we're heading. But I do think that a UPS strike and others, and maybe the auto workers as well, raises a new sort of pressure that could maybe change that calculus. We'll see.
So, Steve, we have a couple more just questions for you here. You're a volunteer organizer for the Detroit Eviction Defense, and the right to work was overturned in Michigan. Of course, it's rooted in Jim Crow, came out of Texas, and also the GO Local 3550 is on strike there in Ann Arbor. And you work with a variety of different organizations, just had the May Day action in Detroit, the Moratorium Now Coalition, and many others involved in that. Why are these, besides the union issues, why are these connections taking place between the housing and these a variety of different struggles that you yourself as a union member are taking part in, but also other union members as well? GO 350, 3550 came to Detroit in a delegation, and they're making these connections between, for example, union rights and housing rights and LGBTQ rights and women's rights, et cetera. And you've been involved in this for a long time. But in the contemporary sense, what do you see as the connections and why they're critical, and some of the actions that might be taking place regarding them?
Well, in terms of housing and Detroit Eviction Defense, and I'm personally sort of shifting towards a more of turning back to some of my labor activism of years past. But in the case of housing, the key for us for many years, particularly when the housing crisis first became acute over 10 years ago, we found that what sustained us and gave us a considerable punch in terms of defending people who were facing eviction was the support of labor. And they had the resources and the people power to bring the necessary bodies to bear when the bailiff shows up, and or to keep the bailiff from showing up altogether, because they sometimes could be dissuaded from carrying out the eviction by the presence of 25, 30, 40 people in front of the house, and other techniques for making it more difficult to them. In the case of Detroit, they have to put a dumpster in front of the house. There are certain steps that have to be followed, and we could interfere with that and delay it. We couldn't always stop it, but we could also win time then for continued pressure on the landlord, continued pressure on the bank, ticketing of the bank. And again, the labor movement was important in this regard, and they saw it as in the interest of their members, because many of their members were at risk, particularly with the mortgage crisis. Less so now when it's more a matter of renters. And so the whole struggle around housing in Detroit has changed. It used to be much more front and center, a question of foreclosure on homeowners. And now we're looking at issues related to, more often, tenant and landlord issues. And that's a harder organizing challenge for a whole lot of reasons, including the fact that a lot of tenants, when they're confronted with, sewage in the basement, or electrical systems that don't work, or doors that don't close, or roofs that leak, unlike a homeowner, they're going to understandably want to move. They're going to want to leave. They might need help and defense in postponing of the eviction to give them a chance to find an alternative place to live, but that's difficult to do these days because there's hardly any affordable housing. So the issue for unions is understanding the needs of their members are obviously not simply limited to their circumstances once they punch in and while they're on the job. It's also the whole universe of issues, of which housing is a key issue.
All right, we're going to wrap it up here. If you have any last comments, feel free to join in here. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up the show. And we thank you for joining us today, Brother Babson. So would you like to have any final comments for listeners?
Well, again, I think, look for the opportunities in your area. If you are if you're a Teamster, if you're an auto worker, obviously you've got some real challenges coming up, particularly in the case of the auto industry, because the union is so divided, and it's going to be a real priority, I think, for the two sides to recognize that they have a common ground in defending the union. There'll be nothing to fight over politically down the road if the union can't prevail in a substantial campaign to address two-tier in particular. But for other folks, look for the opportunities to organize, find your allies in the immediate area, whether it's DSA or a whole range of other groups that are trying to relate to these labor struggles and these housing issues. Look for friends.
All right, listeners, this is We Rise Fighting. Thank Brother Steve Babson for joining us tonight. And we discussed many issues. Feel free to check out his book, Forgotten Populists. There's also a website for that. And also a member of AAUP-AFT in Detroit at Wayne State University. And thanks again for joining us, Brother Steve.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.